I'm proud of all of my dad's accomplishments, but mostly I am proud of his ability to take a broken life and turn it into something beautiful. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce John Frece. John Frece spent half his career as a newspaper and wire service reporter and half working for the state and federal government. He has written 3 previous books, including co-writing the autobiographies of former Maryland Governor Harry H. Hughes and former Maryland U.S. Senator Joe D. Tidings. Frece also wrote an insider's view of Maryland's controversial land use policy known as smart growth. Frece is a former reporter and Maryland State House Bureau Chief for the Baltimore Sun and United Press International. He also covered the Virginia General Assembly in Richmond for UPI and was an editor, reporter, and photographer of the Reston Times. He later worked on the staff of Maryland Governor Paris and Rendon and at University of Maryland Smart Growth Research Center as a director of the Smart Growth Office within the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency during the first 5 years of the Obama administration. Frece is married to the children's books author Priscilla Cummings, and they have 2 grown children, Will and Hannah, 2 grandsons, and 2 cats. Frece graduated from the College of William and Mary, Virginia in 1969 and was honorably discharged as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army in 1971. It is my great pleasure to introduce John Frece.
Thank you very much, Danielle. My wife was supposed to accompany me tonight, but she didn't feel well, and so she sends her regrets. I was going to introduce her to my wife for 40 years, but since she's not here, I'm going to quickly introduce my traveling companion tonight. His name is Bill Lane. Bill, you want to wait? Bill's my friend of 71 years. He's also been a farrier for 47 years. He's recently retired. And he can still stand up straight. Thanks to my friend Gerry Brewster, who we'll hear from in a minute, who really made this book possible. And Shannon Sheets, who's with Gerry, worked with Gerry, and has helped me and helped Gerry a lot with this book. I thought what I would do, thank you very much for having me. I had been working on the Joe Tidings book, and then went to an event with Joe in Harford County and ran into Gerry. Gerry pulled me aside and said, when you finish with the Tidings book, I hope you would consider writing a book about my dad. And what I've told Gerry, and I've said publicly, is I thought to myself, okay, but I don't think there's a story there. And then Gerry sent me his Princeton University senior thesis, which was all about his dad's trials and tribulations. And I realized there was a story there. And that's when we started collaborating, and I started working on this book. It took a number of years. The first thing I asked Gerry was, did he and his family really want to go back through the sometimes painful parts of his father's life? And he said that he would check with his family, and he did so, and got back to me and said, they're okay with it, they want you to do it. And I would say one of the things Gerry has always said to me is try to write the most honest version of the book that I write, and that's what I ended up doing. I would say that the response has been pretty good, and I think one of the reasons the response has been good because it is a book about someone's high times, low times, and then recovery. And I couldn't agree with Danielle more with the fact that he had such a good third act really says something about the human spirit. I wanted to mention a little bit about some of the research that goes into a book like this. One of the most helpful documents I used was Danny's handwritten war diary he took with him to the South Pacific. it allowed him to talk about himself, talk about his then love life, to talk about the horrendous, violent actions he was involved in, both working and particularly Oklahoma. When I started this book, I could tell you that Oklahoma was an island in the South Pacific, and that was about all I knew. And I've learned about Okinawa since then. And what he went through there was, that battle lasted 3 months. There were 110,000 Japanese defenders on the Americans landed, and only 10,000 survived. So it was a pretty brutal fight. Gerry Brewster also has a trove of family history neatly filed in his basement. And I spent a lot of time at Gerry's house. I'd come up in the morning, go down to the basement almost immediately, spend the day there, eat lunch with him, spend the afternoon there. Then I'd usually spend the night. We'd have maybe a glass of wine, maybe. And we talked about what I'd read during the day. And he would explain things to me. He would correct misconceptions I had. Sometimes I agreed with them, sometimes I didn't think of misconceptions. But we had great talks night after night, and I was up there, and I'd spend the night there to do the same thing all day the next day, and then I'd go home. And I did that a lot over several years. Yes, yeah. The University of Maryland had Stanley Brewster's official, and there's no way any researcher would have the time to go through all those papers. So you pick the ones that you thought would be interesting and would be helpful to your story. So I spent a lot of time looking at civil rights files and looking at his files during the Vietnam War. And both of those files were full of very strongly worded letters on both sides of those issues. People for civil rights, people against civil rights, people for what was going on in Vietnam, people wanting us to get out of that war. And you realize if you're an elected official and you have those kinds of pressures on you from both sides, it's really difficult to find the right course and how to represent the law. Priscilla and I, my wife and I, on a trip to Maine, see relatives stopped at New Haven and went to the Yale Library and went to the records there of James Brewster's book, the first ambassador to the Soviet Union. And we found a lot of letters there with between Dan Brewster and his second wife, Ann Bullock, and also a lot of, at that point, when Danny was in Ireland, he was in the hospital for a long time because he suffered from the illness of alcoholism. And there's a lot of material in those documents there. So the research was quite interesting. One of the parts of Danny's life was he was accused by a man who had been his top assistant success of taking bribes. And people who knew Danny his whole life knew that it was really unlikely. And it was probably someone taking advantage of a guy who, as I said in the day, was in his cups. And he was the only accuser, and this was a case that dragged on for 6 long years. And by the time it was over, he had lost his seat in the Senate. He had arguably lost 2 marriages. He lost his integrity from time, which I think was school later in life. And then his sentencing, of course, was his friend, Mac Mathias. The whole issue of that bribery case was when does a legitimate campaign contribution become an illegal fraud? And there was a lot of evidence that what Danny was accused of taking a bribe for was actually a campaign contribution for a position he had always held in the Senate regarding the sign of third-class mayoral rates. It never made sense to people who knew it. I was fortunate to interview one of his first hires when he got to the Senate, a woman named Nancy Del-Sandro. Some of you may know her as Nancy Pelosi. And she and Stanley Hoyer both started their careers in Danny's Senate office in 1963, Black 1962. And so Danny, when I interviewed her, the very first thing she said to me was, I don't believe what you did, I'm paraphrasing, but I don't believe what they charged him, because it was that guy that was with him reportedly. So I think she knew. I'm going to pause and let Gerry Brewster come and talk a little bit about the horse angle to Danny's life, which he knows about better than I do. And then I'll be glad to answer your questions.
Thank you, John. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. This is a great turnout, and Cricket, wherever you are, there you are. We really appreciate your having everybody here at the Maryland Horse Library and Education Center. This is a terrific facility, and John up there is filming everybody. It's going to be online. We thank you for all of your help, and Gerry Reitler, who's in Spain, her husband, Bill. Where's Bill Reitler? There's Bill. So Gerry helped us with the book, too. There were a couple photographs from the Skip Ball collection that Gerry pointed out, and they're in the book also. So the whole team here really did a great job. We can't thank you enough. And my assistant, Shannon, who was back there, Shannon ended up being a great research assistant for John for this book and found stuff that wouldn't have otherwise been found. And so Shannon, we thank you also for what you did. And for some of my family that's here, Danielle, you did a great job. Thank you for being master of ceremonies. And we had a special guest here, and she flew all the way up from Florida and surprised us. Came right here from the airport, and this was the person that made my father the happiest in his life. His wife, Judy Brewster. Judy. I see a couple colleagues. At one point in my life, I was in the General Assembly, and I see Dan Warheim and Ken Holt here. Thank you guys for coming here as well. My father's life started out great. Everything was going well. You know, he was. I don't know if you're familiar with Green Spring Valley Road there. His mother was born in what was called Wycliffe Castle, now Maryvale School. And his father was born in what was called Scrooby Manor, now Gramercy Bed and Breakfast. So you had these two places on Green Spring Valley Road here where the really windy turns are. The father grows up in one and the mother grows up in the other, and they would ride horses back and forth on Green Spring Valley Road. Back in those days, the Grand National and the Hunt Cup, those races were in that area. And so they fell in love, got married, and right next to Maryvale School, which we call Wycliffe, a place called Fernwood. So Danny Brewster and Andre Brewster and Catherine Culver, Brewster Jackson, and Betty Bullock Bowler, they all grew up there at Fernwood, which is between where Kevin Plank's house is and the castle. So that's where they all grew up. Things were going great. Couldn't go much better, you know, and he was the fifth great-grandson of founding father Benjamin Franklin. His grandfather, Benjamin Harris Brewster, was Attorney General of the United States, Everything was going great. And when he was age 10, first challenge hits. He's the oldest of 5, age 10 his father dies of alcoholism. All of a sudden at age 10 he becomes the man of the house. And that was not something he had anticipated. But the whole family was involved with the equestrian community. His grandfather had been master of 5 Hounds of Green Spring. His father had been master of 5 Hounds of Green Spring. His brother Walter ended up being master of the 5 Hounds of Green Spring. So the whole horse community was his life. But he had no father. So he was sent off to boarding school at St. Paul's in Concord, New Hampshire. And ended up being the president of the class, the captain of the football team, won the Scholar Athlete Award, and that became sort of his family. Then he went off to Princeton, and World War II broke out. So he dropped out of Princeton and went and joined the Marine Corps. And he ended up being the youngest combat officer in the Marine Corps during World War II. He was wounded 7 times. Now think of this, you're an officer at age 19. You're going into battle, 19-year-old, 20-year-old, and you got 40 men in your platoon, and most of them ended up dead. They got trapped in a ravine. And those 7 wounds, he was, one night he was in his foxhole, and he sort of heard a noise and looked up and saw a Japanese soldier jump in the foxhole with his knife, started stabbing him. He throws up his arm, and the rest of his life he had 3 scars on his forearm. And his runner jumped up, shot the guy, dropped dead right on top of him. Another time he was talking to his sergeant, Patty Royal, only the distance from maybe me to Skip there, and maybe even closer, maybe about where Judy is. And a porter landed on Patty's shoulder, blew his head in, collapsed his chest, blew his arm off, and he was dead in an instant. And then another time he was shot in the head. And we still have the helmet. The bullet went in one hole, came out the back. And a lot of people said that that time when he was shot in the head, that explains why he went into politics. So he did survive those 7 wounds. And he came back and he had a passion for steeplechase racing. And he came back from the war gung-ho, all out to try to win races, get involved in politics. And so he had quite a schedule. And he and my mother, Carol Brewster, bought Worthington Farms, where the hunt cup was run. And interestingly enough, both of their fathers ran in the first Maryland Hunt Cup on that course, which was in 1922. So Dan and Carol Brewster bought Worthington Farms. I was born and raised there, and they owned that for 20 years. And he in 1948, the My Lady's Manor and the John Riff Street Memorial, 2 races the same day, he won them both. And he ended up riding in 5 Maryland Hunt Cups. And my sister Danielle rode in the Hunt Cup. I rode in it. We have multiple Hunt Cup winners here. I see Charlie Fenwick, I see Joe Davies, I see Skip and Vicki Crawford. Who else here won the Hunt Cup? Well, so anyway, a lot of Hunt Cup participation. So I was sort of determined to ride it. And at one point I was lucky enough to do it. So he's riding races, gets his law degree, gets elected to the House of Delegates, pretty young. He got elected in his 20s to the House of Delegates. Then the U.S. House, he gets elected there at age 34. And he's a United States Senator in his 30s. That's young to be elected to the United States Senate. And he was, both in his time in Annapolis and in Washington, he had the legendary reputation because he was very strong. And in Annapolis, he was rooming with the president of the state senate, who at that time, and there's a relative of a different, this is not about your father, this is somebody else. And this particular president of the senate was absent at night. And my father thought that was very funny, wanted to keep track of him. So he wrestled a parking meter out of the sidewalk, put it in the bed, and they would feed the meter to determine how long he was not in his bed. And another time they needed 1 vote. He was vice chairman of the Judiciary Committee, 1 vote. And so my father and another one of his colleagues grabbed a person that was on the line there about voting. They took him up to the 3rd floor, went out on the balcony, and hung him by his feet over the balcony and said they were going to drop him unless he changed his vote. So there's different stories like that. He ended up winning 12 straight elections, became very close friends with John Kennedy, and with Lyndon Johnson, as John indicated. And by the way, I should say about John. John wrote the book. He wrote all of it and spent 5 years writing it. And not only did he write an incredible book, but the real miracle of this story is that in those 5 years, John did not kill me. Because there were some moments, but John really did write a good book. And John, we all, the entire Brewster family, thanks you for that. We're very grateful. My father was the only Marylander ever in the history of the state to win a presidential primary. And what happened was President Kennedy was assassinated in November of '63. He only was in office for a little bit. And the Civil Rights Act of '64 is the biggest, most important piece of legislation, arguably, in our nation's history. And George Wallace, the racist governor of Alabama, decides to enter a few primaries. And if he can win, it could hold up the Civil Rights Act. So the first couple states were northern states. Wallace saves the last primary for Maryland. The only southern primary, the only one below the Mason-Dixon line. So it's Lyndon Johnson's just become president, and he wants to learn how to be president because vice president is really not, and he wants to also honor President Kennedy by not being out campaigning all over the country. So President Johnson asked Maryland's United States Senator Danny Brewster to enter the presidential primary in Maryland on his behalf to go against Alabama Governor George Wallace. And there was probably some smarts to it also, that if Brewster lost, Johnson would say, well, Brewster ran a terrible campaign. But if Brewster won, then Johnson would say, well, he won because I told him what to do. So it was a tough race. It ended up being nationally debated on national TV. Brewster versus Wallace on Issues and Answers, Howard K. Smith moderating. It was, everyone agreed, all the front page articles, every newspaper in America covered it. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was going to be held up by the Southern filibuster if Wallace beat Brewster. So the eyes of the nation, really the eyes of the world, were on Maryland. And Marylanders came through, and Danny Brewster beat George Wallace by more than 10 points. He was hoping to win by even more, but he won by that. And so at the Democratic National Convention, the Democratic delegates from Maryland, they were committed to Danny Brewster in the first ballot, but then he turned his votes over to Lyndon Johnson. Within 24 hours of Brewster beating Wallace, which again, literally, every newspaper in America, that was the banner headline, Brewster beats Wallace. Within 24 hours, Everett Dirksen, the head of the Republican senators in Washington, got together with Hubert Humphrey, who was the floor leader for the Democrats in civil rights. They got together and Everett Dirksen said, look, Brewster beat Wallace. That was the last chance for these Southern Dixiecrats to hold it up. The Republicans will go with the Northern Democrats. That will be enough votes to get cloture. We need 60 votes to overcome the filibuster. And so the Republicans were the ones that provided the votes necessary to pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964. One of his other proudest legislative accomplishments was Assateague Island was slated for development. It was going to be like Ocean City. All the lots were sold, and he didn't want to see that happen. He wanted to have it preserved. He had a great relationship with Lyndon Johnson. So he put in a bill to preserve Assateague Island forever, to create the Assateague Island National Seashore, and that bill passed. One of the co-sponsors was Joe Davies' uncle, Joe Tidings, and they worked together on that bill to get it passed. And thanks to those guys, Assateague is now saved forever. Excuse me, one second. In the United States Senate, he was very popular with his colleagues, and I'll tell you one story that will explain why he was. In the Senate in the 60s, one senator could hold up debate, could hold up the works forever. It was like Mr. Smith goes to Washington. And so there was a senator named Wayne Morse, and Wayne Morse did that. He would just talk forever. And the senators would rotate who would be stuck presiding over the Senate. If it looked like Wayne Morse was going to speak, it would go into the evening. And my father had told the Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield, Mike, I got to go. There's a dinner being given in my honor in Baltimore, and it's black tie. And if I preside over the Senate, I could do it, but I have to leave at 6 o'clock. Dinner's at 7, it's cutting it close, and I have to leave at 6. Mike Mansfield, majority leader, said, no problem. So my father's presiding over the U.S. Senate, up black tie, maybe a dozen senators on the floor, and Wayne Morse is droning on and on and on. My father's looking at his watch, he's getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And so finally, it gets to the time, and the majority leader said he could leave at 6 o'clock. So he raps the gavel and says, Senate hereby stands adjourned, and gets up and leaves. Well, Wayne Morse almost had a heart attack. And never before in the history of the Senate or since has a senator been cut off mid-sentence. I saw Bill Proxmire a few years later, and he said, Gerry, you know, only 2 people have stopped somebody in the history of the United States Senate from continuing to talk, and that would be God and your father. So, the 1964 race, I want to just tell you how meaningful that was, and then I'm almost done. But in 1964, Lyndon Johnson had just become president, and the Kennedy family, they were shocked, you know, to have President Kennedy assassinated in November '63. And they didn't want to campaign, the Kennedy family did. But this is how important Maryland, your state, was to them. So the Kennedy family got together, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy and Senator Ted Kennedy, friends of my dad's, and they said, this is too important. We can't let the Civil Rights Act of '64 die. It all comes down to Maryland. Maryland's got to vote for Brewster over Wallace. So the Kennedy family decided they were going to make their first campaign appearance since President Kennedy's assassination in Maryland. And they also did TV ads and things like that. And I want to read you, it's just a paragraph, but I want to read you what Senator Ted Kennedy said to all Marylanders that day to tell them how important it was to vote for Brewster over Wallace. So this was Senator's first campaign appearance since the president's assassination. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to the people of Maryland, and I would like to thank all of you who are watching for the many messages of sympathy you've sent since last November to Mrs. Kennedy and her children, and for the prayers you have offered in their behalf. I hope all Maryland Democrats who voted for my brother in 1960 will vote for Senator Brewster in this primary. The lesson should be that we should not hate but love one another, as the Bible preaches. That we should cast our vote and use our powers to create not conditions of oppression that lead to violence, but a climate of freedom that leads to peace. It is in that spirit and that of your own great tradition that I hope all Democrats in Maryland will vote on May 19th for Senator Brewster. That was their first campaign appearance since President Kennedy's assassination. They came here because that's how important that race was. After Brewster beat Wallace, President Johnson addressed the nation also. And this is what President Johnson had to say about the Maryland race. When the going was tough and when the campaign was rough, Maryland produced a courageous and a valiant senator to uphold my hand. And he stood in for me when I couldn't be here. My good and trusted and beloved friend, your great Senator, Daniel Brewster. So Maryland really did contribute a great deal to our nation's laws in a meaningful way. As John indicated earlier, my father had some problems. He drank too much. He had a couple marriages that didn't work out. He was on the wrong side of the Vietnam War when the tide was turning and the country was going against Vietnam. My father was a gun-ho Marine, and he felt if you're at war, you win it. You put everything into it. And so he was all for doing whatever the Johnson administration advocated, which was escalating the war and trying to win it. Too late, he realized that was a mistake. As Danielle and I heard also later in life, our father considered his support of the Vietnam War his biggest mistake of his legislative career. But at the time, he was thinking like the Marine that he was. If we're in it, let's win it. He at one point really reached rock bottom. The country that he had fought for in war, been wounded 7 times, had indicted him. And it was an accusation. He ended up, I want to be clear, he was found not guilty of the bribery charges John referred to. So 12 jurors unanimously found him not guilty. he did pay a $10,000 fine for accepting unlawful gratuity without corrupt intent. But that was the end of it. Then he still was struggling with alcohol. And finally, after going to rehab, back and forth, he met Judy. At the two of them, they were on kitchen duty at the same rehab, and fell in love. And the last 30 years of my father's life were the happiest 30 years thanks to Judy. So in conclusion, my dad didn't live a perfect life. He made mistakes, which he readily acknowledged. And it was his ability to overcome those mistakes that made him an inspiration to us all. We're all flawed, but it's our ability to overcome those flaws and to pick up the pieces after we've fallen that is the true test of our humanity. Thank you all for coming. So, by the way, for anyone, John and I are happy to answer any questions you may have, but also, if you go online, SenatorDanielBrewster.com, SenatorDanielBrewster.com, you'll see about 500 pictures and reviews of his book and everything else. So, and there's Instagram and Facebook and things like that. John? Any questions?
Anyone has questions for either of us? One back, yes, sir.
How did Dan Brewster overcome his alcoholism, and what did he accomplish during those sober years?
Danielle?
Well, I can't really tell you how I wasn't there when my dad had me, he was sober. So I only knew my dad as a sober, loving father. He was very involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. My parents did not serve alcohol at our home growing up, just we didn't have it. And life was just really quiet. You know, a big night out for the Brewster family was we went to Frece here. So it just, alcohol was not part of our lives.
But the rehab, the rehab did a lot to help in meeting Judy.
Well, I just wanted to say that Danielle was born 9 months after we were married. And Danielle, her whole life said, "Mom, we know you and Dad have to get married." And I said, "Okay." So Danielle went on Google and put in our marriage date and her birthday. It was 9 months to the day.
But it was a struggle for him, and it took many, many years. But he did overcome the alcoholism. And Kenny, he fought it hard, but finally won. And Dan Warheim, you were around then. You got to know my father.
Yeah, I
at the
can
hospital.
speak to Ken, probably Sam Rosenberg too, but Ken and I served at the House of Delegates. I was at the clock. But anyway, where I got to know Dan was in Franklin Square Hospital. And I was there in emergency medicine, and he had just arrived out of his new chair to see a new board member. And it was this morning where, if I can share an anecdote, where they show up at the hospital parking lot at 5 in the morning and go tour someplace. I'm from California. I didn't really know very much about America. My wife's from here. I get to the hospital, 5 in the morning, get in the back of the car. Everybody's sound asleep. I'm in the back of the car, sitting next to Dan Brewster. Spent 2 hours going up and 2 hours going back. He shared so much about his life. And he was a tremendous advocate for the movement, which GC department, which was a new field at the time. He was a tremendous advocate for healthcare and the hospital. It's the hospital was relatively new out in Essex from the city. So he did answer Ken's question with what do you do afterwards. He was a tremendous advocate for healthcare for the community. And then when I started to think about politics, he was a mentor of Councilor B. But I would say his contributions to healthcare were substantial, and not just locally, but on the statewide level.
You know, Dan, I was looking at you and Ken, and I neglected to go over on this side of the room. And Sandy Rosenberg, not only did we serve in the House together, but Sandy is the dean of the House. He's the longest serving member of the Maryland House of Delegates. Sandy, thank you for your
Thank you. But we must have some Lyndon Johnson stories beyond.
Yeah, but you know, there are, but they're pretty much X-rated. I mean, so I'll just tell you this one, and it's a little off color, but I'm going to try to tell it as well as I can. Lyndon Johnson was in at that point, he also, when he was vice president, he had the office in the Senate, because he was presiding over the Senate. And so he called my father in for some important thing. And so the secretary said, well, you know, go, Senator, go right on in. The vice president's waiting for you. So my father goes in, doesn't see him. Here's some water running. And he hears this southern Texas voice. Dan, is that you? Come on in here. And so my father goes towards the voice. Come on in! Opens the door, and there's LBJ, buck naked, showering down, you know, and proceeds to have a conversation with my father while he's naked showering. So that is one of the tamer.
I want to go back to the question before about why they stopped cooking. One of the strange things for me about writing this book is I never knew Danny Brewster. And yet I feel like I know Danny Brewster now because of all the time and energy I put into learning about him and his life, and his family, and his friends. And Judy can kick me if she doesn't think this is right, but I have answered the same question in other points by saying I think it was love. I think he got to, it was two things. It was love. He fell in love with Gerry, and that was reason to stop. And I think the other thing too is he finally realized nobody can do it. Nobody can make you stop if you don't want to stop yourself. And so I think he had gotten to a point, things had gone so bad, so long because of it, that he finally realized the only one that's going to stop me is me. And so we did. I don't agree with that wrong. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I think, Judy, you'd agree with that, wouldn't you? Anybody else? Doc?
I'm curious about your craft and writing. If you went into the basement frequently for 5 years, how did you sustain the interest that resulted in such a well-written book? Bless your heart.
We should have said that loud. It wasn't hard because there was, one of the things Gerry and I have talked about a lot is there's so many different aspects to Danny's life. I mean, there's the war aspect, there's the Golden Boy of Maryland politics aspect, there's the achievements while in office aspect, there's the out-of-office involvement. There's the crazy bribery issue. And a lot of these things happened all at the same time. There was this time in Ireland, there was still all of his horses jumping, and he and his brother Walter, spending a lot of time doing the horses. So all of those things were interesting to me in their own right. The Assateague Island, when I went and interviewed a couple park rangers in Assateague about that, and they brought out the plats of what was going to be built on Assateague. And it was from the shore, from the ocean side to the bay side, just solid houses, within the whole thing. And a lot of it was sold. And by the time that became a national seashore, and the federal government had to repay the people who had purchased these properties because the federal government had taken over. And many of the properties by then were underwater. So there were just a lot of different interesting parts, and it was a question of how do you put that flow together from one part to the other. One of the things I tried to use, although I hadn't planned to when it started, but as the more I wrote, was his military experience and his military way of thinking about things, and I think that influenced a lot of his life.
One of the things that my father liked when he was living for us was biographies and political biographies. And he particularly liked Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. One of his favorite quotes was from Winston Churchill when he was going through hard times. Winston Churchill said, "When you're going through hell, keep going." I'll just close with one anecdote that is, I think, is very appropriate. The Charlie Fenwick's farm one time, it was many years after my parents went their separate ways. They both had a horse and trained in Charlie Fenwick off Butler Road. And within many years since my parents had been married, Dan and Carol Brewster. And Carol was driving in. Carol Brewster was driving in, Dan Brewster was driving out. They're sort of looking, I think they recognize each other, and they slow down to say hi, and all of a sudden they both realize it's their ex. But they roll down the windows. My mother says, "Danny, how have you been?" And he said, "Well, Carol, I'm a survivor. I survived the jacks, I survived the booze, I survived the federal government, I survived cancer. I'm a survivor." And she said, "I know, Danny, I'm a survivor too. I survived you." And they both howled with laughter. But the person that really made my father the happiest was Judy Brewster. And those last 30 plus years that you were with him were the happiest years of his life, Judy. Thank you again. Thank you all. And there's pictures in here, or if you haven't seen them, great photo display, books in there, in case you didn't get them. Yeah.